Many of you have asked us to cover what is now being called the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. So this is a phenomenon where protesters have taken over, I think it's about 4 city blocks in the middle of downtown Seattle. It's caused a lot of consternation in the city, largely in our national discourse. And we have a little bit of footage from a local news report on the area, which I thought was the most fair. Let's take a listen.
Protesters are calling the neighborhood the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, now named CHAZ for short. Behind barricades placed by demonstrators are dozens of Seattle businesses, many boarded up, but outside, tents are popping up, filled with everything from first aid to snacks to face masks.
It's not nothing aggressive or violent or nothing like that. We didn't come out here for any of that.
So that has actually spawned a bit of a showdown between the Washington governor, Seattle authorities, and President Trump, with President Trump tweeting that he would basically send in and clean up the zone if the Seattle governor or if the Seattle mayor and the governor of the state, Jay Inslee, would not do anything about it. I have some mixed feelings on this one, Krystal, because as far as I can tell, largely peaceful protests within the zone. However, I do think it is an abdication by the city to just abandon the police precinct and all that. It kind of reminds me of Occupy Wall Street.
I think that's a pretty good parallel. The other reports I saw, they were like children were doing chalk drawings and they watched a movie. I think this is in my view, total right-wing meltdown over not a whole lot. It's 4 blocks. It's peaceful. The city agreed to it. So, there was an attempt by the right immediately to paint all the protest movement as anarchists and Antifa. Well, as we've gotten down the road, there's no actual evidence that this was in any way organized by Antifa. Not to say that there weren't some Antifa people involved, but the idea that there was this mass nationwide network of Antifa activists ready to spring into action was patently absurd and ridiculous. So there was that attempt. I think this is, in my view, another sort of flailing attempt to create some culture war issue when it's really not that big of a deal.
Sure. I want to be clear. There is some violence. There are some apparently there's a warlord in the area, which is kind of hilarious. I think that broadly the way we should think about this, see, I'm very different, which is that you're right. A lot of the people on the right are freaking out about this. And there's an effort actually to conflate it with what happened in Portland about a year ago. But there's a big difference because what happened in Portland was that actually was Antifa. And they were surrounding an ICE zone and basically threatening the lives of federal law enforcement, and the city wasn't doing anything about it. It was kind of an explicit, A, there was violence, but B, threats of violence against government property and all of that. Now, in terms of how you deal with these things, it's very important not to overreact, actually, almost overwhelmingly in these situations.
Because you could just make things worse.
Right.
Right now, it's peaceful and it's fine, and kids are doing chalk drawings.
I do want to say, which is that the issue is the media coverage is always polarizing, which is that, remember the Bundy Ranch or the Bundys who take over Oregon? Those are all armed white supremacists who one of them was literally gunned down by the FBI, and all these liberals didn't care. Media didn't care. They hated their guts and much of those actions. In these types of situations, I actually just recently read a book by an FBI hostage negotiator who dealt with Waco and he dealt with other armed groups. One of the worst things you can usually do in a situation like this, because look, to be clear, there are armed people, seen pictures with AR-15s and stuff that are there openly flouting law, is, as we saw with the BLM and the Bundy Ranch and all that, all it's going to do is ratchet up tension.
Right.
Whenever you deal with a situation like this.
Which we saw that in real time with protests here, where there were crackdowns when people were mostly peacefully protesting, and it leads to these conflicts. It leads to bitter feelings. It leads to more violence, not less. And so, again, I'm glad we played the local news report because, as you said, I think that's the most reasonable and the most fair and the most not trying to score partisan points. To me, it seems like a local issue that's not ultimately that. Because here's the thing: sometimes local issues are really indicative of some bigger trend or problem or some national debate. I don't really see this here except for the president trying to create some culture war issue out of what is ultimately not that big of a deal on a local scale.
Well, I want to give some credence because, look, there was a lot of violence, a lot of looting, previously. And like I said, I think what the reaction is that we have seen in the Pacific Northwest, we have seen Mayor Ted Wheeler in particular and Portland allow actual violence in order to occur on the streets and not let the police do anything about it. I think it's disgraceful, horrible, and what they allowed against those ICE officers is a complete disgrace. This one is a little bit more complicated because there has been some property destruction. There has been some more of that. It's now more of a question of what do you do about it because they allowed it to happen. And so federalizing it the issue and also trying to conflate necessarily what's happening there with what happened
anywhere
in Portland
else
is not always the best. And I mean, we saw in Zuccotti Park here in Washington, D.C., in McPherson Square, that just the way that these things go about and generally like fizzle out and many of these other things, sometimes it's best in order to let that happen. So I have complicated feelings on this. I absolutely support, which is that if there is actual violence, looting, if there's property destruction, like if they're starting to burn stuff to the ground and steal things from people, then I think people should. But we have not seen
any of that
as of yet. There, like I said, there is a warlord apparently in the issue. Who knows? What's going to happen.
Right.
It's a complicated situation.
For me, the most important part of this is the president essentially has made every wrong move with regard to these protests and put him on the side of like an aggressive crackdown, and these are radical Antifa militants and anarchists. And when things calmed down very quickly and became very peaceful, he doesn't know, Fox News doesn't know, like they don't know where to go with this. And so one of their go-to moves is let's find some way to, caricature this entire movement as violent, anarchist, Antifa, radical things that you need to be terrified of. They're coming to your town next. They're not coming to your town next. This is 4 blocks or 6 blocks or whatever it is. It's peaceful. The president just wants to use it as a way to sort of divide and gin up fear and uncertainty in a way that's beneficial.
Yeah, but there's also
I think that to me is the broader story of what's going on here.
Sure, I think there's some truth to that, but I also think we shouldn't paint a narrative and look, I mean, this has been the main disagreement here, which is that I had no problem with, much of the crackdown that we saw whenever there was rioting and looting. It was the reaction to the violence, not the thing that caused it in the first place. But in this particular area, if there is not that commiserate level of violence, looting, destruction, violence against business owners, et cetera, then I don't think it merits a response. And I am always in favor of, if there is not violence, looting, and armed reaction, then it shouldn't be met with that. And that it's only in the worst of circumstances, as I thought that we saw across New York City, Washington, D.C., L.A., and many other major cities, that you can amount to that. So all I would ask some of the left-wingers is that this be extended and have some charity to the right-wingers in the past who were vilified by the mainstream media. The Bundy people in particular. I'm not defending Bundy or whatever. I think that, one of them was a racist and they said terrible things. But look, these things drew popular support and they were treated terribly by the BLM for many, many years, many of these Nevada ranchers. And the coverage in this, I think, is been outrageous.
I think the point is, if you're against the police state, be against the police state in all instances.
Exactly.
Bottom line.
Okay. All right.
More Rising for you after this.